Hello, welcome. So this is a discussion of the third chapter of the Ignorant Schoolmaster called Reason Between Equals. I think it's a really good chapter. There's a lot of depth here. He clarifies some of the points from the earlier chapters, but also, I think, complicates some of those as well. And some of this stuff I think you probably will agree with without much thought, but other things might have really threw you for a loop. And I don't necessarily agree with everything here. So I want to see if we can dig a little deeper here and see if we can think about some of Rancière and Jacques assumptions and where that gets us. Okay, so this first part here opens up with kind of a discussion of the quality of intelligence. He acknowledges that this is just an opinion, right? So that's kind of interesting. You could think that we might have things like IQ tests, different kinds of tests for intelligence, all this sort of thing. He jokes a little bit, at least I think it's kind of a joke, about the phrenologists. If you know who those are, these were these quote unquote a science. It's kind of been debunked now, but the idea was you could sort of feel these protuberances on the skull and determine from that aspects of personality or cognitive abilities and all this kind of stuff. So he kind of brings that up as a way to say, you know what, maybe the things that we have out now, these IQ tests or whatever, maybe we think they're evolved a long ways, or maybe we think those are very scientific, but the phrenologists also thought that was pretty scientific back in the day. So there's kind of a little ribbing, I guess, about that. But he also says that, what is intelligence? Is it something material? Is it a thing? Is it kind of a physical structure? Is it genetics or whatever? Or is it something immaterial? I mean, if you say that it's immaterial, then it doesn't make sense to say you could measure that. I mean, how could you measure something that doesn't actually have any substance to it? It's kind of like saying, is it spiritual? Maybe, because you can't really take out a ruler and measure a spirit, whatever that would mean. So he's kind of playing around with some different metaphors people have for intelligence, I suppose. And then he adds another argument that if there really were people out there that had these superior intelligences, these superior minds, then why wouldn't they just take over everything? Why would we even have governments and laws and all this sort of thing if there are these sort of super intelligent people? Wouldn't they just dominate? It seems a fair enough argument to me. I think you could probably think of some counter arguments, though. Okay, then we get into this idea of attention deficit, and what I would say is an attention deficit part of the chapter, right? Think about it, attention deficit disorder, and you hear that hear a lot about that today. And he says, well, another thing you can look at are infants, really young babies, and you could say they really learn similarly, they behave similarly. It's pretty well known, pretty well documented that kids. Those infants, they really absorb a lot of knowledge. I mean, their brains have been compared to sponges. They're just absorbing all of this stimuli all around them, and they're learning at an incredible pace, right? I mean, they can learn language, the mother tongue. I think this was brought up last time. You could sit down with a kid every day and really try to create some kind of lessons to help them learn language, but they could also just learn it just by almost magically, just by watching, listening, sort of the process that he gets into later. It's kind of interesting, some of these studies that suggest that even the parents that really try hard to teach their kids to speak aren't really all that much more effective than the ones that don't do anything. As long as the kid is exposed to language, they'll pick it up. I've seen some, that seems to be the gist of a lot of research. So he says, okay, well, let's just say for the sake of the argument, say that this is true, that all these toddlers or infants, I guess, are absorbing language like sponges, really learning quickly. But then later on, as they get older, you can definitely see some differences, right? The learning seems to slow down. Some kids are brighter than others. That would be the logical conclusion, right? But Rancière says, actually, you could say that they're all equally intelligent. It's just that some kids have more willpower. They're more interested, more passion for learning. They have they're paying closer attention, let's say. And it's really this lack of attention in some of these kids. I guess some of the kids have more, or they're paying closer attention than these other kids are. And that's really what you're seeing. I mean, he's made that argument before. Here he says, though, brings up an interesting proposition that this lack of attention could be caused by, quote, a learning through the eyes of others, right? So instead of the sort of infant out there exploring the world, just fascinated by everything, I get to a point where you enter a school system, let's say, kind of a formal system of education, and that leads to, it's kind of his argument, right? As soon as you get to that stage, it all becomes stultifying because you're not learning what you want to learn in the way that you want to learn. You're not learning through exploration and all these things. You're just kind of being taught lessons, so to speak. And then, this seems to be true to me in my experience as a teacher. It doesn't seem to matter what I present to students. As soon as it's in that school context, most of the students would be bored out of their minds, right? You could take their favorite movie, but if you bring it into a classroom, just that act alone is enough to make them hate the movie, it seems. So it does seem to have I do see some kind of stultifying effects, and I'm sure you do as well. So then he talks about this a few times as well. This, again, coming back to this idea of the infant being a sort of learning sponge, as I like to think of it. And thinking about how this works, he says, and I can't help but think about video games when I read these things. I keep thinking about all the games that I've learned how to play without having to have somebody over there to train me how to play. I haven't read the instructions. It's pretty much exactly what Rancière or Jacques 2 points out here. He says, you see it first by chance. Then you try to repeat what you've seen. So you could imagine a game. Maybe you don't know the controls, so you're kind of just pressing buttons, and somehow the guy jumps, right? And maybe you don't even remember what button you pushed to make that happen. So you go back again, and eventually you figure out how to make him jump on cue. And then you start thinking about the cause as well. It must have been that button I pressed. And then at that point, you're thinking about words and sentences to try to tell. I guess he doesn't say explain there, but to tell, what it is you're seeing. So you could say, well, I'm pressing the A button and the character is jumping. That seems to be what happens. And then you just keep repeating these steps until you learn everything else. Now, I was thinking about this because I heard another lecture series one time. They were talking about, why people feel like they have I'm a math person, let's say. And one of the examples the professor gave was, if you take a couple of kids in an arithmetic class, right, none of them know how to add numbers. So you got Johnny there. Maybe he's got 1 plus 2 equals 5. Teacher says wrong. That's not right. Goes through several tries like this, and wrong. And finally gets the right answer. And then let's take another kid. Who was that first one? Johnny. Let's take James over here. And let's say 1 plus 2 is 3. Just guesses right away, gets the answer right. So the teacher might say, oh, wow, you got that correct. You're amazing. Good job, And this could lead to this belief in James that he's got some kind of gift or talent for math, right? And this could carry on all throughout his life, just this one little incident. And, ultimately this can make a big difference. If you have the confidence, that can make up for a lot. Maybe there's not even a need to think about something in the brain that affects your mathematical reasoning so much as just that confidence that could come from just sheer chance of getting the answer right. And you can think about sports too. And if you play sports, you might have sports. Some sports you're better at than others, and you could think about this as well. Did your success at that sport, maybe did you just get sort of lucky at the beginning and get sort of beginner's luck, and that sort of led to a belief that you have this innate ability or talent for this? And if so, how does that affect your performance? And now Rancière has another book called Dissensus, where he sort of attacks this idea of consensus. And that's a whole other book. It's kind of hard to summarize it briefly, what he gets at in that book. But if you think about a meeting or a committee, let's say, and the committee says, well, we've arrived at a consensus. And you might say, well, that's good. It's a good thing, right? You've arrived at consensus. But what Rancière says in that book, or argues about, is when you do that, you kind of, the way you reach that consensus is by shutting up people that disagree with the consensus, right? It's kind of like the majority eventually is able to overcome these objections, even if they're really sound and very reasonable objections. You just kind of have to shut them up so you can move on and do whatever it is the committee's supposed to do. So it's kind of a problem at the heart of a consensus. It's not necessarily a great thing when you arrive at a consensus. And we get a little bit of that flavor here in this book when he says things like, well, truth doesn't bring people together. It exists independently and can't be put precisely into words. So this is a very interesting philosophical position. You know, when you want to have a philosophical system, so you got to think about, well, what is truth going to be in my system? I remember Gorgias, if you remember him from your rhetoric history class, and he's known as the nihilist, right? Because he says things like nothing exists, right? And even if something existed, you couldn't know anything about it. And even if you knew something about it, you couldn't actually communicate anything about it. So that's sort of ultimate nihilism. It seems like what Rancière says is that actually there is truth that's out there and you can know it. But the problem is you have to use language if you want to communicate this to somebody else. And this is where it gets kind of interesting, right? So if you can't precisely communicate the truth, that means people have to find it on their own, right? So this is kind of where he gets into this idea of a parabola. So this is why it's so important that these kids have a will and have a desire to learn things in their own way. Because what I'm kind of getting at here is there's no one-size-fits-all method that's going to work for any two people, right? And matter of fact, even if you learn something a certain way, just giving another person those same materials won't necessarily lead to that result, right? They have to find their own way. He says, what's essential is not to lie. Don't lie to yourself, I guess. Don't lie about what you've seen, what you haven't seen, because that's, of course, a bad thing. That would be a way not to learn, right? You probably, somebody mentioned this in one of the nuggets or one of the responses about how if you have a student write an essay on a topic, making an argument, and they already, quote unquote, know the answer, they see the truth. Maybe they don't really see the truth, and maybe they really just need to have more of an open mind. Maybe they've been stultified, right? And I thought it was this metaphor about each of us describes our own parabola around the truth, right? So we're all sort of following this orbit, but I was kind of intrigued by this choice of the word parabola. I had to look this up. What exactly a parabola was, and I found this. I don't even know if this is relevant. I just thought I would include it here for your consideration. So this is if you see this diagram here in the corner, the orbits go around. Thinking about a comet, right? So the comet might, do this, have this huge elliptical orbit. Maybe every 40 years this comet appears. Now, according to this, the parabolic orbit though would just go around once and never come back. So. I don't know if that's relevant for this, but I thought it was kind of interesting choice. And it could just be a translation issue for that matter. So who knows, but it's kind of interesting. Then we get a little more criticism about Socrates and the Socratic method. And I talked about this last time, but he's got this really striking metaphor here about Socrates pretending to lead the student to her own knowledge, but is really the method of a writing schoolmaster. And I got the picture there of the writing schoolmaster. I think that kind of captures what Rancière is thinking about here. So even though it seems to be a non-directive approach, right, you're just asking questions. I guess the idea is they're very leading questions, right? You're ordering, turning, marching, counter-marching. And then the end result is thinking about Meno again, when the slave boy finally discovers this quote-unquote remembered or innate knowledge, he's just filled with veneration for Socrates rather than being convinced of his own intelligence, right? So that's kind of a problem. And this is a little bit more about the truth and the language, about not being able to couch reality into precise words, because language is arbitrary, he says. It's constantly changing, for one thing. If you study the history of the English language, if you've taken a course like that, or linguistics, all these sorts of courses, that a lot of people think language is this very concrete, fixed thing, right? But in reality, it's kind of a big flux. It's constantly changing, and it's never 100% precise. He says there's no language of intelligence. There's no superior language. And again, I was thinking of there's a study in linguistics by William Labov, about Black English vernacular. And I forget the year that came out, but it was kind of controversial. Not anymore, but at the time it was kind of controversial because he basically argued that Black English vernacular was no less logical, less precise than a standard English. You could communicate exactly. You could be just as logical and philosophical and truthful in that vernacular as you could in the other vernacular. Just on a systematic linguistic level, it was equivalent, right? We just kind of delude ourselves into thinking, well, French is superior or English is superior to, fill in the blank language. That's kind of just nonsense, And Rancière or Jacques seems to agree with this. Furthermore, it's good that it's that way, that language is fragmented. He's got this lovely metaphor about these, I think I'm communicating some kind of meaning to you. I'm trying to. Of course, that's who knows how you're translating these words, because all the words I use, the gestures, the sounds, all this kind of stuff, just radiating with meanings, some of which I intend, some I don't intend at all. He kind of says we're just kind of making poetry, right? Almost just everything's kind of poetic, more poetic than we might want to think it is. And that's a good thing, right? Because, as when he talks about the act of the genius, a lot of it's taking things apart, putting things back together, repeating, seeing. So it's, I agree 100% with the Rancière on that. I think it's great. All of the efforts to make it more precise, scientific language, seem to have failed, for that reason, right? It gets a little bit into politics here. It's talking about liberty, and I was thinking about, what you all would think about some of these positions. Seems kind of like an extreme individualism. I almost thought he was talking about anarchy at one point, but it kind of seems to have come back from that, towards the end. But he says here, liberty is not guaranteed by any pre-established harmony. So again, it doesn't matter what kind of government you're born into, right? It's taken, it is won, it is lost solely by each person's effort. So, I'm not sure where that position would fit into sort of the political parties we have. I guess we could debate that. It was kind of an interesting point, about this focus on the individual. And I guess it comes back to his belief that everyone's equally intelligent, right? We all have the capacity, the same level of thinking ability. It's just some of us tend to be lazy, right? And just let somebody else, tell us what to do or what to believe. I'll turn it over to you and let you discuss that. And then he talks a little bit about the Phaedrus, one of my favorite Platonic dialogues. And again, this is, at the end of that one is where we get this Thoth myth, and it talks about the invention of writing. And the inventor of writing thinks it's a wonderful thing, but the god says the god in this myth says, it's actually a terrible thing. You haven't created so much of a way of learning as a way of remembering, right? Or a way of, if you don't know the material, I think he said writing is more about reminding than it is about teaching, something along those lines. And there's all kinds of problems with it, like the text doesn't have the author standing there to explain things to you, and all this sort of thing. So Rancière is going to try to turn this on its head, this idea. He says, all words, written or spoken, are a translation that only has meaning in the counter-translation, in the invention of the possible causes of the sound heard or of the written trace. So for Rancière, I guess that's one of the points he would make is, look, however you would criticize writing, you could make those same criticisms about speaking as well. There's always, it's not like the spoken word just goes directly into your brain, right? You still have to think about what the word is, what does it mean, how does it relate to this situation, and so on. What do I think this Barton guy is trying to say, and all these things. It's a very active process, both speaking and writing. It says the will to figure out that applies itself to all indices, all text, speeches, whatever, in order to know what one reasonable animal has to say to what it considers the soul of another reasonable animal. So I guess that's good news for writers, right? A few of us would want to take Socrates aside in that dialogue and sort of trash writing. I got a more sophisticated take on it, but I'll spare you that. Okay, so then he's got this lovely image of the Jacques in action. He's giving this kid a drawing to copy, right? So here's a drawing of a giraffe. See if you can copy this. And you tell the kid, really look at that, drawing. What do you see? And we talked about this last time, right? The kid might say, well, look, it's a drawing, or it's a giraffe. But then through this act of talking about it, trying to copy it, maybe they start to see, well, this line here is a little thicker than this over here, and this sort of action over here must be a shadow, right? And let's look and see how they made this shadow. So you're kind of delving more deeply into it, but it's kind of about doing something, right? You got this drawing here, you're trying to copy it. As you're going through this process, you're thinking about it, you're trying to see things in it. He says, what you're trying to do here is see the drawing as a language, right? I try to think about this artist is a person just like you. The artist is trying to communicate something to you through this medium of a drawing, right? So you're a reasonable person. The artist is a reasonable person or animal, as he says. So let's think about this language and how we might translate this. It says this can lead to emancipation. So it's not like this exercise. The purpose of the exercise isn't so the kid can become the next, Picasso, Da Vinci, whatever, but to gain some confidence. And it's got this lovely line here about, me too. I'm a painter, right? I can draw. I can see this language. I can see what this message is trying to be communicated is. I can communicate back in that same language. So it's kind of an exciting epiphany, and you probably had classes where the students kind of light up with this sort of realization. One of the things that we talk about in composition is, trying to get the student to see him or herself as a writer, not be shy or embarrassed or whatever, to call him or herself that, to have that sort of confidence, I guess, to say, yes, I'm a writer too, right? Because if you don't have that belief, if you believe, well, I'm not a writer, then you'll never get to that. You'll never emancipate. You'll just be stultified, right? You can have all the grammar exercises you want, but you're always going to be stultified just by that belief that you are not a writer. He says that isn't pride to say, yes, I am a writer. Actually, the pride. I thought this was great. This is really good. So that's not pride to think that you're a writer. The pride comes in when you say, you know what, you're not a writer, or you're not a painter. It's kind of the snobbery, right? The superiority. And when you get there, that's when the pride comes in, and of course, with it, the stultification. For both, this is what's interesting about Rancière. So the stultification isn't just the student that feels bad now. You just said she's not a writer, so she feels bad, she's stultified. But also you, for saying that, have stultified yourself, because that belief in your own superiority is just as bad for you as the inferiority feeling is for her. So it's double stultification. And then we talk about the artisan's role. And so this was bothering a couple of people. The idea of, well, if everybody's equally intelligent, does that mean that everyone's just as good at painting or whatever? Of course, that's not what Rancière is saying. He says conceiving well is available to anyone. So I guess anyone can look at a painting and eventually, I guess, see it closely enough and figure out how to communicate or what the artist is communicating. He says articulating well. That's an artisan's work that it supposes the exercise of the tools of a language. So the tools of a language. So for painting, I suppose that would be the paints you're using, the brushes, the array of techniques you have, this terminology, all of these things that go with painting. Some artists will be able to use that language to articulate better than someone who's just learning, right? I mean, that just kind of makes sense. And then we have a really striking passage, and I just had to read this. It's one of my favorite passages in this book. It's at the bottom. It's at the sort of towards the bottom of page 68, and he's talking here about learning, right? Where do you want to learn? He says, one must learn near those who have worked in the gap between feeling and expression. between the silent language of emotion and the arbitrariness of the spoken tongue. Near those who have tried to give voice to the silent dialogue the soul has with itself, who have gambled all their credibility on the bet of the similarity of minds. It just gives me goosebumps to read that. It's really a powerful prose there. And I think even people that disagree with a lot of what Rancière says will hopefully find some significance and meaning in that passage. Okay, so just to wrap up here, he talks a little about genius, because there's always going to be the person that says, well, geniuses are just, they, if anybody's got a superior intellect, it must be these geniuses, right? They just kind of come out of nowhere. These Einsteins, these Picassos, Michelangelos, Debussy's, and whatever, Mozart's, and there's just something special about their brains, right? As a Rancière, Jacques Attali wants to say, no, it's all the same intelligence, right? It's learning things, repeating, imitating, translating, taking apart, and putting back together. Lather, rinse, repeat. Just keep doing this, and you can be a genius yourself. I mean, this is how Mozart created his masterpieces. It's how anybody else could create a masterpiece. It's just how anybody does anything, I guess, if they really want to do it well. Of course, again, this notion of the will and paying attention is paramount here. What was it? I'm trying to remember the name of that. The tipping point, and then Malcolm Gladwell, I believe, came up with this 10,000 hours, right? So if you do something for 10,000 hours, and I guess run through these 6 steps, you will get really good at anything. I'm thinking about programming a computer. Basically this is how you learn to program, right? You learn some code, you try it out, you repeat it, you find some source code, some code somebody else has written already, you imitate that, you start translating this code for this purpose into this, use it for some other purpose, taking apart code, putting it back together, and then going back through these 6 steps. And you seem like with this you could learn anything, really. Now I have a very similar thing that I teach my 191 students about, kind of a cycle of learning, very recursive process. And he talks a little bit about Racine, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, with his works or not. That doesn't really matter. You could fill in any author there. And he talks about a point where you're reading. I was thinking about J.K. Rowling. A lot of people really love the Harry Potter series. And I think probably part of that is when you're reading the Harry Potter books, you don't really feel like the author's sort of pandering to you. It doesn't feel like a children's book, right? It's not like anybody's talking down to you, anything like that. It just feels like it's almost like you're just sitting across from J.K. Rowling, right? And you feel like a lot of people have when you read Harry Potter, you feel like, I could write as well. Since those novels have inspired a lot of kids and adults even to try their own hand at writing. This fan fiction community is huge for Harry Potter. And I think that's kind of what Rancière has in mind here. We believe ourselves to be Racine, and we are right. So if you love the Harry Potter and you want Harry Potter books, you want to write some fan fiction, you feel like you're J.K. Rowling, and you're right. Yeah, that you're just as intelligent as she is. You have that same intellectual capacity as she has. It's not like she's some kind of otherworldly being and you're just a lowly human. You're actually just 2 reasonable animals trying to communicate to each other. Then we talk about equality and reason, and some other quotes that I just share with you, and I'll tell you what I think about them, and then you can tell me what you think. So reason begins when discourses organized with the goal of being right cease. Now, he'll get more into this in the next chapter. He's kind of got these attacks that he makes on what he considers to be rhetoric. But I think we can all agree with that, was sort of the gist behind that point, right? And again, we think about the students who have, they just know they're right about this issue, and they're just focused on that. And then you say, well, why don't you consider a counter argument? Well, there are no counter arguments. You can't take that counter argument serious. I'm not even going to even consider that. That's not really reasoning, right? That's just sort of ranting and raving. You got to quit thinking about the importance of you got to quit worrying about being right and trying to convince somebody that you're right, and start, listening to this other side, right? Now, we find the right sentences to make ourselves understood by others. So we find the right sentences to make ourselves understood by others. You could really talk about that idea all day, right? Right sentences, making ourselves understood. So it's not about persuasion here, right? It's about making yourself understood, the sort of truth inside you. And then he ends with this idea: men, I would say people, not just men, but anyway, people might be equal. He says this might is what makes a society of humans possible. So really interesting thought there. I'm thinking, well, what about these other societies, right? A monarchy, for example, they clearly don't feel like they're equal to the king or whatever. But this might is what makes a society of humans possible. I'm not really quite sure where to go with that thought. So again, I'll turn things over to you and see what you make of it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this chapter. Lots of interesting things we could ponder, take apart, learn, repeat, imitate, translate, take apart, and put back together. But anyway, I'll leave it here for now, and I hope to see you again very soon. Thank you.